ultimately allowed the Holocaust to take place. Just a reminder, all of the sessions throughout this entire series will be recorded and will be uploaded to the JCRC website. We are hoping to get some information out by Friday afternoon to everybody who has registered for any of the sessions. So look for that information. We are not going to be able to make any DVDs or other kinds of copies, but feel free to share this link to anyone you'd like. And as always, any questions you have throughout the presentation, please post in the chat. So today we are honored to have Kristen Thompson as our presenter again. Kristen is a native Minnesotan who has spent 18 years in the classroom as a history teacher before moving to Washington, D.C., where she was the education program coordinator at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for 5.5 years. During Kristen's tenure at the museum, she developed and facilitated multiple programs that engaged hundreds of educational leaders from across the globe. She also researched and created a museum-endorsed learning module that explores the role of teachers during the Holocaust. And this module, called Collaboration and Complicity, will be the lesson that we have on this Zoom October 30th. So please join us for that. She's currently an independent consultant specializing in Holocaust and human rights education through the company she founded called Humanist Network. She is also an avid photographer, outdoor enthusiast, and dog lover. She's also grateful to continue to visit DC as her daughter lives and works there. And she is also passionate about travel. So it is my honor to introduce Kristen Thompson to teach us today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Welcome back, everybody, to those of you who have been joining us throughout the week, and a special welcome to those of you just tuning in today. We're grateful for your participation. And as Laura mentioned, we have a lot of information to get through again today, so we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. But please, if you do have questions, we'd like for this to be as interactive as possible, even though it's on Zoom, so please don't be bashful in sharing your questions in the chat. So just some things to think about today as we get started. Keeping those questions in front of you again, we want to be thinking about how and why the Holocaust happened, as it was not inevitable. We also want to think about how does examining the rise of Nazism help to illustrate the Holocaust Museum's definition of the Holocaust that we're going to get to in just a moment. And how does a democracy become fragile? How is that even possible? And if a democracy is fragile, then what's the role of each of us as individuals, as responsible citizens, in the process of preserving and protecting the democratic values and institutions of that democracy? So those are some of the things that we're going to be trying to address today through our presentation. So again, I know we went over this on Monday, but we have some new folks joining us, and just to make sure we're always on the same page when we're talking about what exactly is the Holocaust, this is the definition from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. They have a number of historians and scholars who worked very long on what this definition is. They were very precise about the language because language and words do matter. So the definition that they came up with is that it was the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. So today, especially when we talk about the rise of Nazism, we're going to be sort of focusing on that systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored part of the persecution and murder. They go on to say that during the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority. So this would pertain to the Roma. We might know them better by the name gypsies, but that's a derogatory term. The disabled, some of the Slavic peoples, and we're going to be talking about Slavic people today. So that would be Poles, Russians, and others. And then other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds. And among them would be communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, etc. It's also important to remember that the Holocaust was incremental. It happened in steps. It didn't happen all at once. And you're going to see some of those increments being implemented today as we talk about especially the Nuremberg race laws. And it's important to remember that While we have the luxury of hindsight, and sadly we know how this tragic story ends, the people going through it had no idea this was completely unprecedented, what was going to take place, and that it didn't start with the gas chambers, it ended with those, but it started with words. And these words, the rhetoric that was used, it was used for the purpose of dividing the people, creating an atmosphere and a culture of us versus them, creating a group that was considered the other. It also blamed a minority for all of their problems. They became the scapegoat, and we're going to talk about some of those problems today, like the economy. And as we discussed the other day too, thinking about them as a minority, we have to remember that the Jewish people, the Jewish population in Germany was less than 1% of the population. The rhetoric was also used to incite fear, leaving a message of they are trying to take over and take over your way of life. That they could have referred to the communists as well as the Jews. They were inciting fear about both groups. And then propaganda that was used to control the message. And we're going to see all of these elements today in the session that we go through. In order to provide some context, however, for how Hitler actually comes to power, we need to go back to World War I. So we're going to give a brief history lesson on this. And of course, the history teacher in me is happy to get to tie in other elements as well. But if you do have questions about this part, especially, again, make sure you're asking those in the chat. So to understand how Hitler comes into power, we go back to World War I. And World War I started with the assassination of the future heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. They were at the Feast of St. Vitus parade in Sarajevo. And as maps and borders shift with wars, it's important to know what region we're actually talking about during this particular time. So the assassin was somebody who is referred to as a Serb loyalist, but they were actually a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They believed that this region that I've circled on your map in red, the area of Bosnia, should belong to the neighboring country of Serbia, because the people in Serbia and this region of Bosnia, they were all Slavic peoples. And so they wanted to continue this idea of nationalism and self-determination, where you join together like peoples who have a similar culture, similar language, ethnicity, etc. But the assassin is actually a citizen of Austria-Hungary, just that they believe that Bosnia should belong with Serbia because they're all Slavic people. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are riding in an open car in this parade that is taking place in Sarajevo, which you can also see within that circle. So if the assassination of this one man was going to indeed end up in a war, it actually should have been a civil war, because this was really a citizen of Austria-Hungary. But instead, Austria-Hungary blames their neighboring country of Serbia for somehow inciting this idea that they should be joining together the Slavic people. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And then you have kind of this domino effect that takes place. There was a system of alliances that was in place where one country had agreed to protect another, and they had hoped that this would actually promote peace, that it would deter people from going to war. But instead, what it does is, like we said, is sort of this domino effect. Once one country jumps in to help, it pulls in another ally and another after another. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, blaming them for this idea that Bosnia should belong to them. Because Serbia is Slavic people and they're a small country, their much larger country of Slavic people jumps in to help them because they have an alliance. So Russia gets pulled into this once Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. As soon as Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary for this, Germany was an ally with Austria-Hungary, so they jump in. And like we said, it's this domino effect after that. So what should have been a civil war, if anything, for the shooting and assassination of one man, of one future leader, you end up with all of these countries joining in, and it escalates very quickly into a world war. We're going to talk about each of these three leaders more in depth, but just a quick overview of who they are so that we all know who the government leadership is at this time. We have Kaiser Wilhelm II, and W's in German are actually pronounced like a V, so we're going to be talking today a lot about the Weimar Republic and Kaiser Wilhelm. He inherited the throne at the young age of 29. His military generals, however, had great control under his authority in the monarchy. And he abdicates the throne when it becomes clear that Germany is going to lose World War I, and he flees to the Netherlands. The next person we're going to talk about quickly, and like I said, we'll get more in depth with each of these a little bit later, that's Paul von Hindenburg. He was a general during World War I, and he goes on to become the president of Germany from 1925 to 34 when he dies in office. He did not care for Adolf Hitler. He actually referred to him as the Bohemian corporal, which was not a nice thing to say. And so he didn't have any particular care for him at all. However, his advisors convinced him that if he appointed Hitler as chancellor, this would somehow unify the government, and they assured him that they could actually keep him under control, which obviously, again, we know the end of the story, and that's not the case. And then we, of course, have Adolf Hitler. It's important to note that he was appointed as the chancellor by von Hindenburg in 1933. Hitler was never elected. He did run for elections, but the highest percentage he received was 38% of the vote. He was never elected by the people. Once he becomes chancellor, we're going to talk about how he begins to increase his power and authority over time. Eventually, he abolished the presidency when Hindenburg dies, and Hitler makes himself the Reich Chancellor, which is the head of the government, and the Führer, the leader of the people. So Kaiser Wilhelm was born in Potsdam, Germany. He's the son of a prince and Princess Victoria, who was actually the oldest daughter of Queen Elizabeth. So he's got British royalty, British monarch blood within his bloodline. And he actually thinks that during World War I, while he's declaring war on these other countries, he thinks that relationship is somehow going to make Great Britain especially sort of look the other way with their territorial and military expansions. He and his wife, Princess Augusta Victoria, have 7 children together. When his father takes over the throne in 1888, he already was terminally ill with throat cancer, so he presided over the monarchy for just a very short time. So as we said, Wilhelm succeeds him in 1888 at the young age of 29. And under Kaiser Wilhelm, his monarchy was really more of a shadow monarchy. He was useful to his generals as more of a public relations figure. He would tour the front lines, he would hand out medals. After 1916, Germany was in effect a military dictatorship, really dominated by 2 of the generals. One was Paul von Hindenburg, who we know later becomes president, and another general by the name of Erich Ludendorff. In late 1918, there's popular unrest in Germany. This, combined with a naval mutiny, convinced the political leaders that the Kaiser really needs to abdicate the throne in order to preserve order. His abdication, however, is announced before he actually consents to this. He finally agrees to leave when the leaders of the army also tell him that they have lost faith in him, lost confidence. So on November 10th of 1918, the former emperor takes a train across the border into the Netherlands, which had remained neutral throughout the war, and he eventually buys a manor house and he lives there for the remainder of his life. The Allies at the end of World War I wanted to punish Wilhelm as a war criminal, but the Queen of the Netherlands, Queen Wilhelmina, refuses to extradite him back to Germany. The last few years of his life are actually kind of a dark period for him. His first wife dies and his youngest son commits suicide in 1920. In 1922, he remarries, and his new wife is actively petitioning Adolf Hitler in the early 30s to restore the monarchy, but nothing ever comes of this suggestion. Hitler despised the man that he held responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I, so there was no way he was going to reinstate the monarchy. And it was said that Wilhelm was shocked by the Nazis, what he referred to as thuggish tactics. He remarked for the first time in 1938, he was actually ashamed to be a German. After spending 2 decades in exile, he dies in the Netherlands on June 4th in 1941 at the age of 82. So at the end of World War I, we have the Treaty of Versailles, which now creates the Weimar Republic. So Germany is no longer going to be a monarchy. They will be a democratic republic now. They're given the name Weimar simply because that's the town where the Constitutional Assembly met. And it was often perceived by the Germans that this Weimar Republic, this democracy, was really forced upon them by the victors of World War I. Many of the German citizens remained deeply sympathetic to the Kaiser, who was forced to resign. The treaty offended many sectors of the German national folk, mainly because of the following conditions. There were financial repercussions. Germany actually had to claim full responsibility for the war. So even though the first people to declare war was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany sort of took over with their military superiority. And so because of that, they then have to claim full responsibility. They also have to pay the war damages, which amounted to $33 billion. Germany was forced to give up some territory, 13% of their land, and the 6 million people who were living in those regions. And they had to give up that territory to France, Belgium, and Poland. And Germany was also severely restricted in rebuilding and establishing its military force. And the military was really a sense of pride for Germany. And so that was one of the devastating impacts for them of the Treaty of Versailles as well. This map gives you an indication of prior to the Treaty of Versailles and at the end. So both the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire are going to be dismantled at this point at the end of the war. So Germany again has to give up 13% of their land. And you see all of the new countries that are formed out of what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And part of this was to build on the idea of self-determination and trying to put together countries that would have similar people. You'll notice many of those countries no longer exist today, so that didn't work out so well. There were still a lot of issues with the people that they were trying to put together in these countries. So then we come to Paul von Hindenburg. He had followed in his father's footsteps by becoming an army officer. He served with distinction and is promoted to the rank of general. He actually retired in 1911, but he's called out of retirement in 1914 to bolster Germany's efforts on the Eastern Front over in Russia during World War I. He reversed what would have been a catastrophic retreat, so he's hailed as this great victor once again. And towards the end of the war, he's called on to do sort of the same thing on the Western Front in France, where they've dug in their trenches and the war has basically come to a stalemate. He makes one last-ditch unsuccessful attempt to try and turn the tide of the war, but Germany lost close to 1 million men, and Hindenburg and his staff preside over a retreat of thousands of German soldiers. Not exactly the way that he wanted to end what had been an illustrious career. On November 11th in 1918, the armistice or the ceasefire is agreed to. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, all was finally quiet on the Western Front and the war is over with. We now celebrate November 11th, as you know, as Veterans Day in honor of the armistice. And with the ceasefire in place, now it was left up to people to come up with the peace agreement, what the terms of peace would look like. In 1919, Hindenburg retires for a second time, leaving the aftermath of the war, as well as the responsibility for Germany's defeat. He leaves these now in the hands of the new civilian government. A parliamentary commission calls on Hindenburg to testify regarding the defeat of Germany, and he doesn't want to admit that the military actually had been defeated on the battlefield. So while he is called upon to testify, he actually claims that it's the people on the home front. There's this stabbed in the back myth, and that's part of his testimony that he gives. He blames the Jews, the communists, the socialists, the founders of the Weimar Republic, all of these groups of people supposedly working together on the home front against the military, saying that they didn't support the war effort any longer, and that's why Germany was defeated, according to him. In February of 1925, Hindenburg is asked to run for presidency of Germany in a bid to try and unify the country. Once they become this democratic republic, you have lots of different political parties vying for power and authority. And so they have constant elections, and it's just a scene of chaos. And so people are trying to come together under one leader, and they think he might be the person to unify the country. He won largely due to his own popularity and because there was a huge lack of cooperation among the left, so many political parties. During his administration, however, he struggled almost continuously to create and maintain a cabinet that could remain in power and effect any sort of real change. He was very frustrated by the chaos of the Weimar government, and so he often just ruled by decree using constitutional articles, which basically gave him authoritarian power. So he could sign some sort of an administrative act and enact it by himself and not have to worry about Parliament. That strategy, together with the disunity and the unrest of the period, fanned a widespread desire for political stability among the German people. And this is one of the things that helps to facilitate Hitler's rise to power. And as I said, Hindenburg really loathed Hitler as a man. He despised his boorishness and his methods. He did, however, share the common anti-Semitism of many Germans, especially those of the elite class, of which he was a member. He didn't really want to appoint Hitler as chancellor, but in his aged and weakened condition, he was easily persuaded by the conservatives who dominated Hitler's first cabinet to give Hitler his way, including when it came to anti-Jewish policies. And as long as the economy was improving, the violence in the streets is brought under control, and the socialist aims were thwarted, Hindenburg and the conservatives were pacified, so they kind of looked the other way at a lot of the things that Hitler was doing. His only requirement when it came to some of the early anti-Jewish laws that we're going to talk more about in just a moment, his only requirement was that for the law of the restoration of the professional civil service, which contains the first definition of who's supposed to be considered Jew and who's Aryan, he wanted the Jewish frontline veterans who fought in World War I to be exempted from this so they could keep their jobs. Later, however, upon Hindenburg's death, Hitler gets rid of that provision as well. So again, he actually testifies where he blames the Jews, the communists, the socialists, founders of the Weimar Republic, all conspiring behind the military's back, not supporting them, and that was the reason that Germany was defeated, according to him. There were lots of economic problems that were starting to emerge, and they persisted over time, and this also aided in the rise of Nazism. You have the economy failing after World War I. The Great Depression is going to be starting in 1929, but it's made even worse in Germany, who owes this monumental war debt of $33 billion. Inflation is going through the roof. People start losing faith in this democratic system due to the poor economy. So they start listening to extremists who promise that they alone can step in and fix it. And people are desperate at this point. They actually want to believe that somebody can step in and make it all better. So you have extremist leaders beginning to emerge, people like Mussolini in Italy, obviously Hitler in Germany. So there were a number of challenges that also set the stage for Hitler's rise to power. Again, there's this political turmoil and violence, there's economic hardship, and there's also some newly found social freedoms and a vibrant artistic movement. And that causes change that people aren't necessarily ready to handle either. So World War I left Germany a shattered nation. They have 2 million young men who had been killed, 4.2 million wounded. So 19% of the entire male population were casualties of the war in one way or another. At home, the civilian population is suffering from malnutrition as a result of an Allied blockade, where starvation is a serious issue for them. Workers are going on strike, attempting to gain better working conditions. In 1917 alone, there were 562 separate strikes, which is hard to even fathom. And those most responsible for the war itself and the accompanying human and economic disasters, so meaning Kaiser Wilhelm and his generals, including von Hindenburg, they handed this debacle to the new civilian government when it becomes responsible for conducting peace negotiations. The political issues, the violent confrontations between left and right-wing extremists. At least 1,200 Germans died in 9 days of street fighting in Berlin just in 1919 alone. Frequent elections, like we said, there were 10 elections within 14 years, because if you don't get a majority, then you have to have another election, and you've got all this chaos with so many parties trying to run. 3 major revolution attempts also occurred in the first years of the Weimar Republic. So there was great instability with this new political system. The economy, we said, was terrible, and the cost of living rose in Germany 12 times from 1914 to 1922. The government sought to pay their reparations simply by printing more money. And as we know, that is not something that works. Instead, it just devalues the currency that you have. So this led to hyperinflation. The exchange rate went from 64.8 Reichmarks to $1 to where at some point people actually were having to convert, and it was going into the billions of an exchange rate to $1, which is hard to even fathom. There was a time when people were even being paid twice a day so that they would fill up their wheelbarrow with currency and they try to buy anything that they could before the currency lost its value. It was happening that rapidly. And then the social new freedoms that people are experiencing with the Roaring 20s until they're cut short by the Great Depression. You have women getting the right to vote, urban areas are booming, and it's causing a lot of social change. And this again was a time when people were just wanting to have some sense of normalcy. So these changes on top of everything else they were facing was just really too much for many of them to handle. They just wanted some return to the old ways. So we're going to listen real quickly to survivor Frank Sherman, and he's going to talk about what the inflation was like in pre-war Germany.
There was an inflation where people didn't figure in millions, but in billions. They were paid in billions. And when in 1927, 28, no, earlier, 1923, 24, 25, when people were paid as workers, they would leave the moment after they were paid and run to a grocery store so that they could then buy grocery before the money was worthless the next day. And it was an unbelievable, insecure situation, which many people feel today was the fodder for Hitler to utilize this and say to the Germans, is that really what you want? Or do you want me to come in and correct all this?
So as we said, then the Great Depression takes place. And of course, it's made even worse in Germany because of the war debt that they owed. So with countries demanding payment of these war reparations that Germany did not have, the German government faced the classic dilemma of, do you cut government spending in an attempt to balance the budget, or do you increase it in an attempt to jumpstart the economy? They choose to cut the spending, and so this cuts a lot of the programs for the people who really needed the help the most at that moment. And because of this, again, they start turning to extreme leaders that somebody could fix it, and elections are held more and more frequently. When we look at the background of Adolf Hitler, it's important to know that he's actually from Austria. He's not German. Basically, everything that he really idolizes in what he considers the perfect Aryan race, he's kind of the opposite of that. He was a school dropout, never received a diploma from any school. He had quit school at age 16, moved to Vienna when he was 18. His father's already passed away at that point, and he refused to get a job. This was a choice that he made, so he insisted that his mother send him an allowance. He tries to enter the Academy of Fine Arts, but again, with no diploma, they're not going to admit him, and he twice flunked the entrance exam. His mother then dies, and he becomes homeless. Again, he's making a conscious decision at this point rather than even attempting to get a job. So he sleeps on park benches for about 5 years rather than getting a job. His ideology starts to form at this time regarding politics, nationalism, racism. He believed that each nationality was a race, believed that the German people were superior, and believed that only one strong leader was necessary. He didn't want the ignorant masses, as he referred to them, to have a say in government. He also became angry with the Jewish people during this time, the ones who were operating the soup kitchens that were actually feeding him while he's made this choice to not even attempt to get work. He's angry with them and wondering, why should they have more than me? He blames the Jews for not getting into the Academy of Fine Arts because there was one Jewish person on the admissions committee, but again, he has no diploma and he flunked the entrance exam. He also blamed his mother's death. She passed away from cancer. He blamed that on the Jewish doctor. In 1941, when World War I began, he went to Munich to join the German army rather than fighting with Austria. For 4 years, he ran dispatches or messages along the front lines in the trenches in Germany. This was a very dangerous job, and he actually was very good at it. He won 4 medals for bravery. However, you would think somebody who has done this and was successful at it would be promoted. He never rose above the rank of corporal because his commanding officer said he was really mentally unstable, and they didn't trust that he could be put in charge of other soldiers because he was just unpredictable. They didn't know what he would do. In 1918, when the war ends, he's in the hospital recovering from a gas attack that left him temporarily blinded. And that's when he finds out that Germany lost the war and that the monarchy has toppled as the Kaiser has fled, and he blames the Jews for Germany's defeat. He believed that he survived the war for some sort of divine mission, and he said that he needed to rescue Germany from the democratic republic that it had become. He needed to rescue Germany from the Jews and the communists and the traitors who stabbed Germany in the back, according to him. Many political parties, like we said, were vying for control during this time. He was a very charismatic speaker. That's one gift that he did have. So he was asked to become the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which is the Nazis. At the time, they only had 6 people in the party when they asked him to be their leader because he was a good speaker. On November 8th in 1923, he and the Nazis, which the party has grown by now, tried to take over the German government in effect of having a coup. It's called the Beer Hall Putsch. They had locked the government officials in a back room of this beer hall, and Hitler proclaims himself dictator at that point. The government officials managed to sneak out a window, go around the corner, call the police, and the Nazis are supposed to be arrested. The police and the army show up. They open fire. There are 16 Nazis killed, but Hitler escapes at this point. He's later captured and jailed for treason. And of course, the penalty for treason, if he's found guilty, is the death penalty, which would have meant the end of Hitler at that point. Hitler represents himself in trial. Again, this is a school dropout, but because he's such a charismatic speaker, he manages to talk his way out of it, saying that his actions were really out of patriotism and love for the fatherland, that he wanted to restore Germany's honor and glory. And because he was such a persuasive speaker, he persuades the judge and jury. So instead of a death penalty, he receives a 5-year sentence, of which he only serves not even quite a full year. While in prison, he writes, although it's more accurate to say he dictates, his book called Mein Kampf. His spelling and writing was so poor, he actually had other prisoners help him with it. But the book Mein Kampf, or My Struggles, it's published in 1925, and it's sold very poorly. Many thought it was actually the work of a madman. Later, when he's in power, people buy it and put it in their window just to show that they're a good Nazi without maybe really having read it. His book outlines his plan to conquer Europe, including Russia, said Germany needed this Lebensraum, or living space, to create his master race, and that Eastern Europeans would become slaves of Germany, and that he would make Europe free of Jews. So his plan is all laid out in his book. He also realizes at this point that his attempted coup to try and take power illegally isn't the way that he's going to be able to maintain power. So he knows it needs to be legitimate from this point on, and that he needs to go through the election process. So even though, like we said, he never receives a majority, he doesn't win an election, he does realize that he's got to go that route. So with the Weimar Republic's new government structure, they've got a president who's elected by the popular vote to a 7-year term. And his job is really the chief constitutional officer, making sure the Constitution is not violated. But other than that, it's more of a formal symbolic role. But the president does have the authority to control the military and call for new Reichstag or parliamentary elections whenever he wants. In a nod to some of the conservatives who were afraid that too much democracy would be a bad thing, the framers of the new Constitution added the element of this Article 48, which is going to become important. It allows the president to assume emergency powers, and it suspends civil rights. And you can operate without the consent of the parliament for a limited period of time. And the president invoked this quite a number of times. The position of the Chancellor is really the chief legislative officer, so they're the one who makes the policy. They're responsible for appointing a cabinet and sort of running the day-to-day operations of the government. And then the parliament is elected by popular vote, and the seats are distributed proportionately. So even if you have a very small minority party, if you win a certain percentage, you get so many seats within the parliament. So that too allowed for this great vast array of different political parties coming in and having a voice within the system. So with the Kaiser gone, we're now left to simply having the president, von Hindenburg, who appoints Adolf Hitler as the chancellor. And as we said, he didn't really want to appoint him as chancellor, but he gets talked into it because the conservatives say that they can actually control Hitler. Well, 1 month after Hitler is appointed as the chancellor, on February 27th, 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, is burned due to arson. The Nazis played on people's fear and they used their propaganda to promote the story that they wanted to tell, claiming that the communists had set fire and this was their plan for a violent takeover. So they claimed that emergency legislation was needed in order to prevent this. And so they come up the very next day with what is called the Reichstag Fire Decree. And the act officially was called for the protection of the people and state. So sort of trying to get across the message that this is for your own good. It justifies on the false premise that the communists are planning this uprising to overthrow the state. And so it permits the new Weimar Republic to suspend the following rights of the people. The right to assembly, so it banned demonstrations, political marches, meetings, suspended their freedom of speech, freedom of the press, other constitutional protections, including some restraint on the police. Now it was okay to arrest and imprison political opponents without really a specific charge, and you could confiscate people's private property. It dissolved all the political organizations other than the Nazis, and it gave them the authority to overrule state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. Even the United States was buying into this official word that was coming out from the German government that it was really the communists that were trying to lead this takeover. So there's a quick little film clip we'll watch here.
Here you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire. The main hall in which the deputies conducted their debates has suffered most from the conflagration. And after the general election which is about to take place, Parliament will have to find a temporary home elsewhere. Flames are no respecters of persons, and President Hindenburg's own chair was also destroyed. Hitler, now Chancellor, has announced that the fire was the work of communists and was intended to be the signal for a Bolshevist uprising throughout the country. In consequence, Germany has been placed under a system of martial law, a decree having been signed which aims at the total destruction of communism.
And so you see in the picture, the firefighters arriving to put out the flames, and then also there's a raid on the Communist Party headquarters where civilians are bringing out loads of these papers and the police officers are simply watching them. Sorry. Oh. I'll stop moving my screen around 1 second. I apologize. Right after this, Dachau concentration camp opens up in March of 1933. It was the first camp established by the Nazi government. Originally, it was intended to incarcerate the political opponents to the new regime. But by the end of 1933, they had almost 4,800 prisoners. Almost all were imprisoned for political reasons. So they were socialists, communists, the Social Democrats, a political party opposing the Nazis, advocates of trade unions, etc. It was located on the grounds of an abandoned munitions factory near Dachau, which is about 10 miles northwest of Munich. And it served as a prototype later on for other camps that the Nazis would build. So then in March of 33, we have the Enabling Act. Parliament passes what they call the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich, which is commonly referred to as the Enabling Act. It allows Hitler to propose and sign legislation into law without consulting Parliament. It effectively creates a dictatorship in Germany. And since the passage of the law depended upon a 2/3 majority, Hitler and the Nazi Party used intimidation and persecution to ensure the passage of the law. They prevented all 81 communists and 26 of the 120 Social Democrats from taking their seats. They actually had them arrested and detained, so they couldn't take part in this vote. And the Enabling Act would allow Hitler to enact laws, including the ones that violate the Weimar Constitution, without the approval of either Parliament or even the President. The Supreme Court actually upholds this and says that it was okay that they didn't allow everybody in to be seated to actually take part in the vote. And so with the with the courts legitimizing this, it becomes law and basically makes Hitler the dictator. So a quick review of the events that most immediately precede his becoming a dictator. You have him appointed as Chancellor, the Reichstag Fire, then the Reichstag Decree, where it takes away the people's rights, freedom of the press, speech, right to assemble, increases police authority. Then you have Dachau concentration camp opening up for political opponents, and then this Enabling Act is passed as well. Well, the next step is the anti-Jewish laws and decrees. And so one by one, like we talked about, there's this incremental process that takes place. The Jewish people are now going to start losing their rights. And of course, this is all part of his plan. So now that he has the authority under the Enabling Act, laws and decrees are enacted one by one. And it's important to note that because it was incremental, a lot of the people, when you talk to survivors, they talk about how their family said, well, yes, of course, we didn't approve of these measures and we didn't want these things to happen. But there was sort of a mindset that, well, it's just one thing and this will pass at some point. And then the next law would come about and, well, it's just one little thing. And so there was sort of this making excuses because it didn't happen all at once, because it was incremental and it was one after another, that if you would have jumped to the end right away, probably more German citizens would not have gone along with it. So it was slow, but it was steady, and it was one law after another. So in April of 33, we have the boycott of the Jewish businesses. And then for a lot of the vandalism that was taking place, the Jewish people actually had to pay for the destruction that was being committed. On April 7th, 1933 is the civil service law that is going to remove opponents from civil service, including schools, universities, government positions, so doctors, lawyers, engineers, etc. And this is where Hindenburg had that provision that if you were a Jewish frontline veteran of World War I, he wanted them protected. But when Hindenburg dies, Hitler gets rid of that exemption as well. And then in April of 33 is the education law, where Jewish students can be no more than 5% of the student population. And Nazi ideology becomes introduced in the school curriculum. By May of 33, we have the burning of what they considered un-German books. So the Nazis raided libraries and bookstores across Germany. They have a huge torchlight parade where they're singing chants and they're throwing books into huge bonfires. On that night alone, more than 25,000 books were burned. Some of the works were by Jewish authors, including Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. Most of the books were by non-Jewish writers, including some famous Americans like Jack London, Ernest Hemingway, Upton Sinclair, even Helen Keller. But their views differed from what the Nazi ideology was, and so they didn't want those thoughts to be available to the German citizenry. In July, we have the sterilization law, where they would forcibly sterilize those with physical and mental disabilities. 400,000 Germans were sterilized just within 1 year. There was a belief that if you had a physical or mental disability, your life was unworthy of life and you were a burden on society. And so they didn't want them to procreate and have children. In October, you have the censorship of the press. Newspapers could not publish anything that would weaken the strength of the Reich, either at home or abroad. And in November of 33, they were authorized to hold prisoners indefinitely, even if offenses had been completed. Often they were then transferred to concentration camps. Part of this idea of Hitler trying to create his perfect Aryan race, doesn't want anything to get in the blood that might be considered not part of his Aryan race. In August, President von Hindenburg dies at age 86. And with support of the German military, Hitler becomes the new president in addition to being chancellor. So at this point, it is a true dictatorship. Hitler abolishes the office of the presidency, and he announces that he himself is going to be the Führer, the supreme leader of Germany. And there will be no limits on his restraints of authority at this point. And he actually, at the funeral, has the military swear an oath of loyalty to him by name, since obviously von Hindenburg was well revered and respected within the military, and Hitler wants to make sure that they now are going to be completely loyal and obedient to him alone. Some of these we're going to go through rather quickly because we're starting to run out of time. So the anti-Jewish laws get amped up and increased now that Hindenburg is dead. So in March of 35, there's mandatory military service. Jews are forbidden to serve, but everybody else is supposed to, and Germany's now rebuilding their military, even though this completely violates the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Reich Citizenship Law gets introduced in September of 1935, the Nuremberg race laws. So they defined who's German or Aryan and who is Jewish, defined Jews as a race rather than a religion, which it actually is. And supposedly you can identify the Jews by blood and genealogy rather than by religion or culture. And the Jewish people lost their citizenship and become subjects of the state at this point. On the chart that you see, the white circles, this was supposed to be how you determine who's Jewish and who's Aryan. The white circles represented the Aryans or the Germans. The black circles represented the Jews. And a partially shaded circle represented a mixed race or the Mischlings. And only full Germans were entitled to full protection under the law. And again, more and more laws and decrees. So now we have the law for the protection of German blood and honor. Racial definition is explained. So now if you have, they've clarified that Germans who descended from 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were now considered Mischlings or the mixed race. If you have 3 or 4, then you're considered Jewish. A Mischling can still vote and hold civil service job, at least for a short amount of time. Later, that's going to be rescinded as well. The Nuremberg laws now get expanded to include Roma and Sinti and African Americans. So they now, or excuse me, Afro-Germans, they lose their citizenship as well and have to carry around racial identity cards. In the next year, Jews are banned from public parks, restaurants, swimming pools, not allowed to own bicycles. They're expelled as veterinarians, teachers in public schools, tax professions. And this little girl who's going to the community swimming pool, there's now a sign posted saying Jews are not allowed. The laws sort of become more relaxed in 36, only because Germany is going to be hosting the Olympics, and with 49 other nations attending, they don't want to see what's actually happening in Germany. So they take down many of the signs where it says that Jews are forbidden to enter these places. But then after the Olympics, the signs go back up and things amp up again. So in 38, we have the Jewish name law, where now any Jew is required to take the middle name of Sarah for women and Israel for men. You have to obtain a new passport and an ID card that's going to be marked with a J on it. In 38, Jewish people could no longer attend plays, concerts, own phones, have a driver's license. You had to disclose all of your Jewish assets, anything that was worth in excess of 5,000 Reichsmarks. They were excluded from the economic life and businesses. They're expelled from public schools at this point. They put restrictions on their freedom of movement. They have to surrender precious metals. So each one of these is really taking away both their right to move and also any sort of wealth that they might have. And in a lesson that we're going to talk about next week, we talk about the challenges of escape. And part of it was because of all of these laws that have already taken away any financial means that they have, or any way that they have to try to still travel and have any sort of movement. So we have a quick clip we're going to play here where he talks about his experience.
In autumn 43, there were curfew for the Jews, 8 o'clock, between 8 o'clock at evening until 8 o'clock in the morning, we had to stay home, we can't be on the streets. And I remember 7:45, my mother asked me to go to buy some bread. And I went to the bakery, who was across the street, and it was already almost dark, 7:45, and I was surrounded by young teenagers, boys and girls, and they knew that I was the only teenager Jews in this neighborhood. I told them, I have a curfew, I have to go home back. And they said, no, we are going to wait 8 o'clock to bring you to the police, that you broke the thing. That was the teenager games, you know, that's stupid. And I was very, very worried because first my father didn't see him because they can go out to, and and I was like that, and suddenly I saw a couple coming, a very tall man with his wife. He wearing a medal of the First World War. He came in a very strong voice. He said, "What's happening here?" And one of the boys said, "You know, we had the Jew and we are going to bring him to the police." There was silence. And the man said, "That is what they teach you in school?" Nobody answered. And he said, "You are not ashamed? I was a fighter First World War, 20 against 1. And I saw all these people, you know, who are teenagers, you know, to have fun." They all dispersed, and the wife came to me and said to me, "Go home and next time be more careful." You know, you have some people like this who...
So as the curfew is being imposed and he's out just trying to get bread for his family, and the group of teenagers is trying to keep him out past curfew so that he could be arrested. Additional measures are enacted. So in 39, we said the surrender of precious metals. You know what? I think this went back a slide. 1940, the telephones were confiscated. In 41, now they have to wear the Yellow Star of David. They're forbidden to use public telephones. They can't leave the country. And in 42, the announcement of the death penalty for aiding Jewish people is announced.
I think we children felt it more acutely because of the harassment that we received almost on a daily basis in school and on the street, and on a different level than the parents. The parents thought initially that this would blow over, you see, until more and more laws, where the Nuremberg laws and other laws were introduced, which made it more difficult. We couldn't have the same maid in the household anymore. We couldn't buy in certain stores anymore. We couldn't go to a swimming pool anymore. We couldn't go into parks anymore. When all of these laws were introduced, we really felt it more and more year after year.
So as we said, it was truly incremental, and it was one law after another that was passed and taking away their rights. And at this point, I think I'm going to stop really quick and ask Laura or Susie or Sammy. The time is shorter than I thought we would have at this point, and so we can either watch a few minutes of Path to Nazi Genocide or open it up for questions, or I'll let one of you three chime in at this point.
Yeah, there's so much that you've covered here, and it's so important, like you said, the incremental steps and the decrees and the laws. I mean, it's just amazing how the depth of the hatred that seeped into these laws. So let's just pause for a second and see if anybody has a question from our audience, from people listening. If anybody wants to post a question in the chat. Kristen, you've done a remarkable job. I know that this is
a lot of information,
content,
yeah.
but a lot of history here. We have a question, why don't we take, which says, how is it decided who was a Jew?
So I'll give part of an answer, and if any of the rest of you want to chime in, feel free. There were a variety of methods that were used. One of the ways, like we said, was with that chart, and so it was determined on your genealogy if you had family members who were considered Jewish. And one of the ways that they went back to even decide that was the Nazis would go through Jewish cemeteries and write down all of the last names. And so therefore, if you had a last name that matched, it didn't matter to them if you were a practicing Jew or not. You simply had the name of people who were considered Jewish, so they assumed that you must be Jewish as well. They would go to the synagogues and get the membership rolls, and same thing if your name appeared on there, even if you were no longer active. So there were a variety of ways that they would do that. And of course, Hitler believes that being Jewish is actually a race. And so they also did so-called scientific testing. There was nothing scientific about it, but they would measure the circumference of your head, the distance between your eyes. There were all of these physical features that he believed Aryans had versus what Jewish people would look like. So there were also these so-called pseudo-scientific measures that would be used also to determine if you were Jewish or not. And feel free, any of the rest of you, to chime in if I'm missing some things.
Oh, I think you answered it. Anybody else have a chat? Have a question? I think because of time, because we have 3 minutes left, why don't we can do a couple things. We can either post the Path to Nazi Genocide film. So this film that Kristen is referring to in her last slide is available on the United States Holocaust Memorial website. Like I said, we're going to have everything, links to resources on the JCRC website. And Kristen, do you have it handy to put it in the chat? Otherwise,
Sure.
I can try and find the
I just put it in right now.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you, Susie.
So if people watching right now, you can go to the chat, click on the link, and that film will show. It's definitely worth watching. Well, we are so grateful, Kristen, again, for your expertise, your teaching. We know you have a wealth of information, and we look forward to learning from you for the rest of the week and the rest of the series. Tomorrow's session is the power of propaganda, and the presentation is going to focus on the propaganda utilized by the Nazis to reinforce their message, depicting Jews as the enemy and the Aryan race as superior. It'll be another rich conversation, another rich learning lesson. And please tell your colleagues and your family about these sessions. They run for another 2 weeks. So please pass the word on, and we thank you for joining us today. Goodbye, everybody.